Welcome back to the Great Text Hour, and welcome back to literature. We've been looking at philosophy with Plato and Aristotle for the past several weeks, and now we return to the genre of epic. Of course, we've already read Homer's Odyssey in this class, and the question now to answer is, how does Vergil differ from Homer? And what other things is Vergil up to in this also very famous epic? Of course, Vergil is writing in Latin, just as Homer provides the great epic for ancient Greece, or epics of ancient Greece. Vergil supplies us the great epic of Rome. This is the greatest work of literature that the Roman Empire produced, arguably. So what's going on with the Aeneid? Because there is a lot going on. What I'd like to do is focus on some of the contextual background that you need to have in order to appreciate what Vergil, this amazing poet, is up to. The first thing, of course, is Homer. It's not just that he's writing in the wake of Homer. He is very self-consciously engaging the exact same Homeric world. We are again going back to Troy and back to the Trojan War as the inciting incident for what will eventually become the founding of Rome, the greatest empire that the world has ever seen. Vergil's debt to Homer is crystal clear, and you can see what he's up to right from the very first line of the Aeneid. Automa virumque cano, of arms and a man I sing. Did you notice in just that one line, I sing of arms and a man? In that one line, he has encapsulated both of Homer's epics. The Iliad was about arms, it was about weapons and warfare, and the Odyssey was about a man. And when you read the entire Aeneid, you will see that he has basically included both Homeric epics into his one masterpiece, the Aeneid. Because books 1 through 6 of the Aeneid recount the wanderings of Aeneas, and that, of course, corresponds to the Odyssey, whereas books 7 to 12, the second half of the Aeneid, recounts the war that takes place in Italy between the Trojans and the Latins. And that, of course, corresponds to the Iliad. So he's taken both of Homer's great epics and combined them into a single narrative. Not that he's retelling Homer's story, but that he's using those two different genres and combining them. So it's very Homeric. You're going to see a lot of the same characters, a lot of the same gods, as well as the same war. But here's the interesting question. He has the Homeric world being portrayed, but is it the Homeric world view? Does Vergil see the world the same as Homer did? And again, I think we get a clue from the very first page. Here you see both similarities and differences with Homer. Let's look at that first stanza together. I sing of arms and of a man. His fate had made him fugitive. He was the first to journey from the coasts of Troy as far as Italy and the Lavinian shores. Across the lands and waters he was battered beneath the violence of high ones, for the savage Juno's unforgetting anger. And many were his sufferings in war, until he brought a city into being and carried in his gods to Latium. From this have come the Latin race, the lords of Alba, and the ramparts of high Rome. Tell me the reason, Muse, what was the wound to her divinity, hurting her so that she, the queen of gods, compelled a man remarkable for goodness to endure so many crises, meet so many trials? Can such resentment hold the minds of gods? A lot of similarities with the opening of the Odyssey, don't you think? Remember, in the Odyssey as well, we got a little snapshot of our hero. Odysseus was described as having several characteristics, but two of them stood out. Number one, he suffered. Odysseus was a man of sorrows, a man of suffering, a man of pain. And number two, he was cunning. Similar, but not the same with Aeneas. Aeneas is also described as enduring a great deal of suffering. So we're getting a similar opening snapshot and some similar characteristics. But one thing we will learn about Aeneas is he is not cunning. He's not stupid. I'm not saying he's stupid, but the word that's translated here as goodness is the word pietas. We get our word piety from it. You remember how Odysseus was constantly called godlike Odysseus? Well, the most common refrain for Aeneas in the Aeneid is pious Aeneas. Pious Aeneas. Now, piety today has a certain kind of religious connotation. You think of a pious grandma as a grandma that faithfully goes to church or prays or puts flowers on the altar. These would be sort of acts of piety. Pietas in the Roman original Latin sense of the word does include religion as well. But it's more than that. Pietas means loyalty. It's loyalty to the gods. It's loyalty to one's family. It's loyalty to one's ancestors. The perfect image of Aeneas's pietas is when he's coming out of the burning embers of Troy in Book 2. Where, what is he doing? He is holding his household gods, carrying his father on one shoulder, and holding his son's hand with the other hand. He is bringing both his past and his future out of destruction because he is loyal. He's loyal to his father, loyal to his gods, and he's going to provide for his son. That's pietas. That's loyalty. Do you think Odysseus was terribly loyal? I mean, he has a certain devotion to his family, to be sure. But Aeneas is a very different kind of hero than Odysseus. Virgil is not giving us a Homeric character. This is a new kind of man. Aeneas is giving us is a model of a different kind of man. In other words, he's a Roman. He's not a Greek. He's a Roman. So it's not necessarily the same worldview as Homer. And I'd also point out one other interesting difference in this opening passage. Remember when Homer begins the Odyssey, he says, "Speak, O Muse, tell me about Odysseus. Fill me with the story of these men and gods so that I can recount it to mortal ears." Homer is portraying himself as the mouthpiece or the oracle of the divine. There's also an invocation to the muse in the beginning of the Aeneid, but notice it doesn't come until the second stanza. The opening line is, "I sing of arms and a man. I, Vergil, am doing this." And when I finally need to ask the muse for help, it's not to help me craft my own poetry. It's not to help me tell the story. It's to answer a question. Why was Juno such a witch? I'm tempted to use stronger language, but I'm trying to keep it clean for YouTube. What the heck is Juno's problem? Why is she so maniacally opposed to poor Aeneas? Help me figure that out. Help me figure out the mind of this crazy goddess. But the poetry, I got it covered. I'm Vergil. So, We get a different kind of hero, and we get a different kind of poet. Vergil is not doing everything that Homer would have done. So there is indeed a Homeric background to the Aeneid. There is also a very important political background. I've already mentioned the Greeks. I've already mentioned how Aeneas does not see himself as part of the Greeks. Greece is an important part of the background. The main political turmoil, however, is Carthage itself. Rome and Carthage fought 3 horrific wars against each other. Carthage was in North Africa. Rome, of course, is in Italy. So picture a map of the Mediterranean with Carthage at the bottom, Rome at the top. They were both great powers, and they grew in prominence. It was only a matter of time before these two superpowers came to collide as they vied for domination of the Mediterranean basin. Plus, they hated each other's guts. The Romans hated the Carthaginians. For one thing, the Carthaginians practiced infant sacrifice. They would throw their babies into this giant fire pit dedicated to their god Baal. And the Romans were disgusted with that. They also practiced infanticide when the child was deformed. But throwing healthy babies into a fire pit, that's disgusting. And interestingly enough, we thought for many years that this was just Roman propaganda. You know, nations lie about the other guy when they're at war. But sure enough, decades ago, archaeologists were digging in Carthage, and they found the evidence of a giant pit filled with hundreds of infant bones. So the Romans had reason to despise the Carthaginians. They fought 3 horrific wars. It's the stuff of legend. Hannibal and the elephants marching over the Alps. The fatalities. There was a single battle, the Battle of Cumae, 80,000 dead on both sides. Imagine that. 80,000 dead on both sides. Think of the size of the population back then. Think of the weapons they used. Europe would not see casualty rates that high again until World War I. This was a maniacal hatred between two peoples. And when they were burying the dead at the Battle of Cumae, they found a Carthaginian soldier lying on top of a Roman soldier, both of them dead. And when they pulled off the Carthaginian soldier, they saw that he had chewed off the cheek of the Roman soldier. They were both mortally wounded. And the Carthaginian was filled with such hatred that his last moments on earth would be spent gnawing on the cheek of the Roman soldier. That's how insanely maniacal this hatred was. So the question is, where does that hatred come from? What could explain this over-the-top animosity? And Vergil's answer is, a woman scorned. Dido. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. So part of the purpose of the Aeneid is to provide some explanation for this maniacal hatred between Rome and Carthage. By the time Vergil is writing, the Romans have won. When they won, they made sure they would never have trouble from Carthage again. After they won the Third Punic War, they razed Carthage to the ground. They left no stone unturned. And, according to the story, to make sure the Carthaginians, whichever ones survived, didn't come back to that city, they salted the earth all around it so that no crops could grow for decades and decades. There's a famous line from the Roman historian Tacitus: "The Romans make deserts and call it peace." They sure did after they defeated the Carthaginians. Greece is another important part of the story. By this time when Vergil is living, Greece has been conquered by Rome, conquered militarily. The Romans grew in power. The Greeks never got necessarily weak, but eventually when Rome and Greece collided, the Greeks did a terrific job defending themselves, but in the end, they were no might. They had no, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, the Romans just won. Now, when they won, something interesting happened. The Romans conquered the Greeks militarily, but then when the Romans marched through the cities of Greece, they realized, whoa, we may have defeated these guys on the battlefield, but they are way more advanced than us, culturally speaking. Their art is better, their architecture is better, their literature is better. They're doing things in astronomy and mathematics, and we're just kind of a bunch of dumb redneck Romans. And so one of the interesting things is that even though Rome won its wars against Greece, there was an interesting Roman inferiority complex with respect to the Greeks. They knew that they won, but they also knew they were inferior. And that Roman inferiority complex is going to be a big part of the Aeneid as well. The final important thing, politically speaking, is the rise of the Roman Empire. For the first several hundred years of its existence, Rome was a republic. It was a free regime, or at least a regime of free men who were senators who collectively ruled Rome. But then there arose a man named Julius Caesar, and Caesar accrued more and more power. He declared himself despot for life and began to impose a number of radical changes to Roman government that ultimately deprived Roman citizens of a lot of their freedom. And there was a concern that Julius Caesar was becoming a tyrant. The big concern was that he was going to declare himself king, and that was a title the Romans absolutely despised. So the Romans got worried about Julius Caesar, and eventually several prominent Romans, including some of his friends, assassinated him. And when that happened, Rome was plunged into decades of civil war. Costly civil war. And when finally the smoke all cleared, Julius Caesar's nephew, Octavius, who later renamed himself Augustus Caesar, became the ruler. And at that point, Rome shifted from being a republic to an empire. And Vergil is writing about basically the divine rationale for this new Roman Empire. And notice, this must have been extremely discombobulating to the average Roman. I mean, think of yourself with your own American identity. When you think, what does it mean to be an American, you don't think a particular race or ethnicity. You think of a particular political regime. You think, what does it mean to be an American? To practice democracy. Our identity as Americans is tied to the form of regime that we have. Rome was very similar to the United States of America in the sense that, unlike the Greeks, it was not a race-based regime. It wasn't Greek versus barbarian. You could come from any corner of the globe and become a Roman citizen. And then when you did become a Roman citizen, you were part of the team. And to be a Roman was to have a particular political identity, that of a republic. So imagine going from this particular identity, I'm an American, I believe in democracy, and then suddenly there is a fundamental regime change. America is no longer a democracy, we're now a monarchy. Can you imagine how disorienting that would be? Well, that's how the Romans felt. They were disoriented going from a republic to an empire. One of the reasons why Vergil wrote the Aeneid was in order to provide a rationale for empire. To let them know it's okay. It's the only thing that's going to save us from going back to these awful civil wars. And more than that, he gives you a promise. At the bottom of page 10 of Book 1 of the Aeneid, in our edition, this is around line 385, we get the gods talking, and we get a prediction of what's going to happen. Aeneas is going to be responsible ultimately for the founding of Rome. And why is that a good thing? Vergil tells us, Romulus, who is a descendant of Aeneas, shall take the rulership and build the walls of Mars's own city. Romulus shall call that people Romans, after his own name. I set no limits to their fortunes and no time. I give them empire without end. Imperium sine fine. Whoa! What's the justification for all this bloodshed? The civil wars, the wars with Carthage? Don't worry, Vergil says, it's all good. From this chaos, the gods are going to give us an order that will be a blessing to all mankind forever. The Roman Empire will bring peace on earth. It will bring what was called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. So this is a very different kind of epic because it gives a promise of deliverance. Aeneas is also different from the other Homeric heroes because unlike them, he has a sense of mission. He has a purpose to life. Odysseus' purpose was just simply to get back home. He didn't fit into a greater whole. Aeneas does. Aeneas is to bring peace on earth. And that's why he has to suck it up and do his duty and take a lot of hardship and grief. But all of it is going to mean something. All of it is going to go somewhere. So, a lot of things going on politically. There is one other thing that is going on as well. And I have not written it on the board yet. What else has happened in between Homer and Vergil that has been of great intellectual significance? What has happened between the 8th century BC and 1st century AD? Or to be more specific, what happened in the 5th and 4th centuries BC in Greece? Did there not arise a new way of looking at the world called philosophy? Didn't we not see this in Plato and Aristotle? Did we also not see in the Republic Socrates talking about a quarrel between poetry and philosophy? What that means is that any poet who writes after Socrates is going to have to somehow address this Socratic critique of poetry. So the question is, what does Vergil do with philosophy? What's he doing with all these things? A lot of people think that the Aeneid is nothing more than Roman propaganda. It is nothing more than a prop to justify the empire. I want to know if you think so as well. One way in which it may be more than just propaganda is the way it engages philosophical thought, which, as you know, is not propaganda, because it's not about propping up the cave. Philosophy is about getting out of the cave, getting away from the shadows of political propaganda. Remember when we saw Demodocus in the Odyssey? He was the blind poet who sung of the Trojan War. And there is the possibility that that actually was kind of a mini portrait of Homer himself. Well, there's a bard in book 1 of the Aeneid as well. He's called Long-Haired Iopas, and he is singing at a banquet held for the Carthaginians and the Trojans, who at this time are friends. And the Carthaginians love this guy. And what does he sing of? Does he sing of war? Does he sing of the journeys of a man like Odysseus? No. Long-haired Iopas, whom mighty Atlas once had taught, this is around the last page of book 1, lifts up his golden lyre, sounding through the hall. He sings the wandering moon, the labors of the sun, the origins of men and beasts, of water and of fire, and of Arcturus, the stormy Hyades and the twin bears, and why the winter suns so rush to plunge in ocean, what holds back the lingering nights. Huh? What's he singing about? He sings the wandering moon, the labors of the sun, astronomy, the origin of men and beasts, water and fire, natural history, chemistry. In other words, he's singing of knowledge. A bard is singing of knowledge. Now, if Iopas is a mini portrait of Vergil, then the question is, what is the Aeneid ultimately about? Is it simply about political propaganda? Or is it about philosophical transcendence? Okay, so we've already seen some of the big themes that are already about to come up in the Aeneid. And now we need to turn to some more of the specifics in books 1 through 3. I'm not going to repeat the summary. You can look that up online easily enough. Though obviously I do hope you are doing the reading and enjoying this, because this is gripping, gripping drama. Vergil was a master poet. But let's just focus on 3 themes that emerge from books 1 through 3. The first is Aeneas the man. And the question is, what kind of man is he? What character profile would you give him? We already saw 2 of these characteristics the last few moments ago, and that is his pietas, his piety. He is pious, he is loyal. And the second thing, of course, we noticed was his suffering. And in life as in literature, first impressions are always very important. Do you remember our first impression of Aeneas? What is the very first time we see this man? It is in book 1, and it's in the midst of a storm. There's somewhere in the Mediterranean, it's dark, the waves are crashing, the wind is howling, and Aeneas is sick of it. He looks around, he puts his hands up like this, which is the Roman gesture of prayer, of supplication. And he says, "Why don't you just kill me now, gods? Why did you bring me all the way from the burning embers of Troy to die this watery grave? Where are you taking me now? I'm so sick of it." Our very first impression of Aeneas, when we see him with our own eyes, so to speak, is of a knee buckler, a guy who is spent. This is not what you'd expect from a great hero. And then, of course, he washes ashore. And he's greeted with great hospitality by Dido, queen of the Carthaginians. And it is during a banquet that he tells his story of how the Greeks had snuck in through the treachery of Ulysses, Odysseus, and opened the gates and destroyed the city and killed his wife and destroyed Trojan civilization, and he and a hardy few soldiers and other settlers escaped by the skin of their teeth and then eventually made it to Carthage. Book 2, and I'm going to be skipping around a little bit. Book 2 is interesting for a number of reasons. One is it shows that Aeneas may be pious, but he's not perfect. He makes several strategic military mistakes in the course of defending the city that night. He assumes the disguise of Greek soldiers. He wears their helmets in an effort to get past their guard, but then Trojans see him and start giving him friendly fire. So it was not a perfect night, even though he certainly did try his very best. So Aeneas is an interesting character, needless to say, to watch. And the thing to keep your eye on is, does he change? Do you see a change in his character or personality as the story unfolds? Or is he just like the same, two-dimensional figure? The other very interesting group that we get an insight into are the Carthaginians. Now, I told you before what they became. They became, for lack of a better word, practically satanic. They worshipped a really dark god. They practiced tons and tons of infant sacrifice. They were, if you'll forgive me for saying so, they were the Aztecs of the old world. Very bloody, very violent, and steeped in a very sort of dark religion. So that's what they became, and yet Vergil describes the Carthaginians initially as the exact opposite. As a matter of fact, he describes them almost in terms of a kind of a secular humanism. Let me explain what I mean by that, by describing these ancient people as secular. The last thing they are building is a temple. It's still under construction. The palace is built, the courthouse is built, all these other public buildings dedicated to progress and science are built. And they're not atheists, so they are building a temple. They're getting there. They're getting around to that. But it's not their top priority. And what do they sing? What do they enjoy hearing about? We already saw this in the last segment. They enjoy hearing Iopas sing about knowledge. Notice the reaction that they have when Iopas finishes singing about the stormy Hyades and the twin bears, and why the winter suns so rush to plunge in ocean, what holds back the lingering nights. The Tyrians, another word for the Carthaginians, applaud again. So they're enthusiastically responding. And the Trojans follow. The Trojans did not simultaneously erupt in applause. They see the Carthaginians applaud, and then they start applauding as well. So they weren't as taken by this encomium to knowledge as the secular-minded Carthaginians were. So picture the scene like this. The Carthaginians hear Iopas singing about knowledge, yay, knowledge. And they're like, oh, yes, bravo. And the Trojans who are seated at the dinner table are like, yeah, that was good, sure. Very, very different culture. The Carthaginians at this point in their history, as Vergil portrays them, are a kind of progressive, secular society where they're interested in scientific progress, and unlike the Trojans, they're not that pious. They're not that steeped in religion. They don't have that pietas that Aeneas has. And speaking of a lack of pietas, our third category is the Greeks. Boy, is Ulysses, Odysseus, portrayed unfavorably in Book 2 of the Aeneid. What was seen as a smart move, cunning, in Homer is seen as despicable. And Ulysses knows no bounds. He has no shame. He has no limits. He defiles the temple of the Trojans. Nothing is sacred to the cunning of Ulysses. It's a magnificent portrayal, by the way. When you read it in the Latin, you'll notice that every time Ulysses is described, there are lots of S sounds. Ulysses, and the things that he does. And in other words, it's an echo of a snake. He is a serpent. He is a slimy, sneaky snake. And even the language of Vergil echoes that. Probably the worst Greek to be portrayed is Sinon. He's the guy who swears that on a stack of Bibles, so to speak, that he was going to be used as a human sacrifice in order to gain the trust of the Trojans so that they would let him into the city instead of murder him, let their guard down, and then he could open the gates, open the belly of the Trojan horse. It's ingenious. Sinon played upon anti-Greek prejudice that the Trojans had in order to make the Trojans more trusting. Because when the Trojans heard that the Greeks were about to sacrifice Sinon, their immediate reaction was, well, of course, just like those disgusting Greeks. Didn't they sacrifice Iphigenia at the beginning of the Trojan War? Of course, that's just the kind of thing those scum would do. So Sinon is ingeniously playing off of their prejudice against the Greeks in order to literally bring the Greeks into their city and change their lives forever. What an interesting strategy to play upon the prejudice of your audience in order for your audience to accept the very thing they're prejudiced against. I invite you to consider whether Vergil, with his anti-Greek prejudice being portrayed in the Aeneid, is playing a similar game. And if so, what is the Trojan horse that Vergil has, and what's inside it?